What we now call Watauga County was first inhabited thousands of years ago by Native Americans. It doesn't appear, however, that any tribe had a permanent village here when the first white Europeans started arriving in the mid-1700s. That doesn't mean that it was a wide-open, free-for-the-taking, first-come, first-served sort of place. It was just the opposite. It was a highly contested hunting ground that both the Cherokees and their bitter enemies, the Catawbas, claimed. The last thing that either one of those tribes wanted was another competitor in the area. And, according to international law at the time, nobody from Great Britain was even supposed to be there. But that didn't stop a few hardy souls from climbing the Blue Ridge Escarpment, chasing furs and fresh meat, and thereby setting up one of the region's first documented tragedies.
The British signed a treaty with the Cherokee around 1760, 1762. And the treaty stated that no one was supposed to be west in the western mountains. Say, beyond the Yadkin Valley to the west, nobody was supposed to settle. So the Cherokee signed this treaty, and they were allowed to go out and burn and kill anybody that they found in the area. And around 1764, William Linville and his brother and an indentured servant had built a little shelter over near the falls of Linville Falls. And early that morning, they were attacked by Cherokee and Creek Indians and killed William and his brother. The indentured servant was shot in the thigh, and he managed to crawl off before the Indians got into the camp and scalped him. So William had brought a young horse with him to train, and the indentured servant was lucky enough to catch the horse because it came back to camp. And he got on the horse and then fell off the horse, and when he did that, it ended up breaking his thigh because it had already been sort of shattered from the gunshot. But he managed to get onto the horse and go back to the settlement and say what had happened. So William was a brother-in-law to Daniel Boone. So Daniel Boone gathered a party up, and they came up here and retrieved the bodies. And later, William's wife gave the indentured servant the horse that had carried him out from the attack. And that's why Linville's named Linville now.
Despite the ever-present danger, white European hunters continued to trickle into the high country throughout the 1700s. The region had a reputation for being rich in wild game, and they wanted to take advantage of it.
Well, originally, one of the main things was the hunting in the area. It was very lush with game and stuff, and Daniel Boone was big in coming up here to hunt in the summertime, and the pelts gathered then were summer furs and not winter furs like people want today, because basically what they were selling was the hide, the skin part, not the fur. And that was all going to Europe, because the Europe had the craze of beaver hats and buckskin clothes.
It's hard to believe that European royalty, used to silks and fine linens, would be interested in buckskin hats and clothes and gloves. But it's true. Who can explain high fashion? The fact of the matter is that hunters did come to this area to hunt, even when they weren't supposed to, and it was dangerous. But how exactly did they get here, in a time before roads or even good paths, especially over mountains that can best be described as brutal?
Several years ago, I did several years' worth of study on how did people get into the southern Appalachian Mountains, especially this area. If you look at Watauga County on a three-dimensional map or a raised map, you realize you come across the Piedmont of North Carolina and you get to Wilkes County, and then it goes like this. And the simple answer to how did people get up here is most of them didn't. Most of them hit the escarpment of the Blue Ridge and said, let's go north. Let's go up into Wytheville, and we'll cut across over the mountains there on part of what became the Cumberland Trail, and we can drop back down into the lower areas of Tennessee, and it's a much nicer area anyway. We're out of the bad weather. There's better soil. A lot of the people went south. They crossed through Bright's Trace on Roan Mountain to get over into Tennessee or to settle in that area. And then you had the few that actually looked at the escarpment and said, oh, well, we can find a way up there because we don't have any other choice. And there were a few trails up the mountain, mostly originating out of the Wilkes County area coming up through Deep Gap. There's a lot of conflicting information on which way Daniel Boone came up through here, and he wasn't the first anyway. So they came up a lot of different ways, and Boone almost certainly came up all of the ways possible, looking for the best one and depending on the weather. If he came up through Ajo and it was raining really hard, he was going to have some streams to cut around. It may have been easier to go a little bit further north and cut up through Elk and up into Deep Gap area.
Despite hard journeys over terrible terrain, people continued to come into the high country. It really makes you wonder why, considering there were much easier routes to the west. I think that the fact that people still came, despite the difficulties of the journey, really says something about their toughness and their desperate desire to have something of their own.
The character of the people that moved up into the mountains was a kind of an unusual set of people. They were either first generation or second generation, usually, sometimes third generation, from Europe, that had packed up everything and left with very little expectation of ever seeing their family or their homeland again. They were leaving. They were on their way out. They got to North America, and of course the good lands were settled early on, and some of them simply wanted more space. Anyway, they were trying to get out of what they'd left behind in Europe with the crowded conditions, the government oversight and control. And when they came up here, they came for a variety of reasons. Some of them simply because they were too poor to buy land. They could come into the mountains and say, yep, this 1,000 acres is mine now. Now, they might lose that in claims court 10 years later, in which case they'd move 50 miles further west and say, this 1,000 acres is mine. And that happened with a lot of families. They just kept moving until they finally got a really good claim somewhere that they could hold on to. Some of them left because they were being hunted for various reasons. We had a fair share of outlaws. And when I say that we had outlaws moving into this area, I don't mean necessarily that we had murderers and thieves. We had a few of those. But you could be an outlaw for not paying your taxes. You could have been imprisoned for not paying your taxes. If you'd had a bad year farming, you didn't have the money to do it. You didn't have a choice. You were a criminal because you didn't have money to pay what was owed to the crown. You had two options. You go to debtor's prison, or you just pick up and leave.
Prison or taking off for the frontier? I know which option I would have chosen. Honey, pack the wagon. We're heading for the hills.
And in the 1700s, if you made it into the mountains, the odds were good that the king's men were not going to come looking for you. You were right off at that point. You were out of their hair. Officially, before the French and Indian War, moving up into this area, you were moving into French territory anyway, which was illegal too. After the French and Indian War, moving across the Blue Ridge meant that you were moving into Cherokee territory, which meant that you were a criminal once again because you weren't supposed to do that. At some point, people quit worrying about it. You know, I've broken so many laws just trying to live, it doesn't matter anymore. And there you get that deep-seated mistrust of authority. So many of these families came up here because they were getting out from under that. And that kind of hung on. They were far removed. They didn't have a lot of regular visits from people in authority, and they decided they liked it that way.
By the time of the American Revolution, you had a few families who had clawed their way up the Blue Ridge Escarpment, built cabins, and started small, widely scattered farms. Distrustful of government and just wanting to be left alone to live their lives, they had zero interest in anything happening off the mountain, so to speak. The last thing they wanted to do was get involved in a war.
The people that lived in this area didn't really want to participate in the war because they had a family and they had crops that they had to take care of. They basically just wanted to be left alone. So they wouldn't really choose sides. But when, say, Ferguson dispatched by Cornwallis, decided that he was going to march his men over the mountains and lay waste to the land and kill their leaders, they said, wait a minute, we're not going to put up with that. So all these people that were just out living in the frontier gathered together and buried Ferguson on top of Kings Mountain and then went back home. Most of them 3 weeks later, after the battle, went home. There was few that stayed and fought in other skirmishes and stuff. Some fought with Nathaniel Greene at Guilford Courthouse.
Following the Revolution, more and more families started streaming into the high country. Some had land grants given for service in the Revolution, but most were looking for free or cheap land. Some stayed in the area, but many moved on.
Some of the original families that came up the mountain, the Wards came up fairly early, the Hicks, the Presnells were a little bit later on, some of the Romangers, a lot of the names that we still have today in the county, Browns, a lot of names that we see in the early rosters aren't here anymore. Their families moved on. They said, that's enough of living on this rock, we're out of here. So it's really hard when you look at the original lists, the original tax rolls from the 1780s of the families that were coming up here. I'd say 50 to 75% of those family names are no longer here at all. You have a few families that were very early on and that did stay in the area.
Life for those first settlers in the mountains was hard, really hard, because the area was completely uninhabited. They had to do everything for themselves. Stores were non-existent. Their first task was to get the land cleared so they could get crops in the field, or else they would starve. Because of this great need, they often didn't have much time to spend building a cabin, so they settled for a simple lean-to or even a cave.
Well, Cutliff Harmon was the first ancestor in my family to move here. Cutliff came from the area around Randolph County, Randolph-Rowan County, and as far as we know, he was born there. And then what brought him to this area was he supposedly was helping Daniel Boone and James Robertson transport goods to Sycamore Shoals near the Watauga settlement in Tennessee. And he passed through the Cove Creek community and liked it so well he just wanted to stay here. The family tradition is that he lived in what they called a rock house. And a rock house is basically more or less a cave, I guess, with a rock overhang. But in this particular instance, newspaper accounts in later years described it as a 3-chamber, 100-foot-high cliff in the mountain. And we're still not exactly sure where it's located, we've been told. And so we're working on identifying that. But it really wasn't unusual for mountaineers in those days to live in rock houses initially until they could get their own homes built.
Once they had a shelter, temporary or rough as it might be, early settlers wasted no time clearing the forest and putting seed into the ground. They didn't have a choice. The only thing they had to eat was what they could grow or what they could hunt.
When a family moved up here, they were going to have to not only build a home, or at least a shelter, they were going to have to clear out enough trees to farm. So those first few years were especially difficult. It was a lot of tree clearing by axe and saw.
They got up at daylight. They went to bed at dark. Time was not really, a watch especially, was not really used. I mean, you had to, somebody had to cut wood and split wood because there was a fire pretty much all the time to cook with. They'd get up and cook. Then they'd start their chores, which would include milking the cow, cutting wood, carrying water. So somebody had to be out feeding the livestock and then plowing the ground, which was a big chore at the time, especially here because it's so rocky. Probably had one kid out there throwing rocks out of the field as the other ones plowed. They had to get their crops in early because the growing season's slow and long, or not long here, it's short. And it was a gamble. There's cases of late frost, snow in June here. and stuff, and a lot of times they'd lose their crops. And so they had to be self-sufficient on that. There was a lot of storage of food when harvest time came. A lot of times they wouldn't have enough fodder for the animals, so they'd start slaughtering pigs and cows and stuff and putting that meat up. So it was hard work, but then I think they were happy because there wasn't a whole lot of stress other than just that work. You know, it was a thing they knew they had to do every day. It wasn't like something new happening in their life, or having the boss come in and come down on them because they showed up late for work or something. It was just get up, do your work, sit around, go to bed, get up, go to work.
As tough as life was for the men and the boys, life was even harder for women. Not only did they have all the chores to do to keep the home running, but they also had to worry about the dangers of childbirth in an area with no doctors and no hospitals.
Life in the Carolina backcountry after the Revolutionary War, for a woman in particular, was rough. If you had male children, they were the ones that went out and did the hunting, but then you were cleaning the meat. Then you, along with all of that, you had to cook 3 meals a day. You cleaned your house. You cared for the other children in the house. You mended clothes. There were no hospitals. If you were in labor, your neighbor, your oldest daughter, would have helped you deliver the baby. You know, no medicines, no epidural, and the risk for death was great. Death for the baby, death for the mother.
Life and death was an everyday consideration for those early Watauga pioneers. Tragedy through a miscarriage, a farming accident, or from something as simple as a snake bite could strike at any moment. And it makes you wonder about how those people thought about their lives and what role religion played or didn't play in their lives. The answer isn't obvious and might even surprise you.
The role of religion here in the mountains is a very difficult thing to pin down. On the one hand, you have this concept of the mountain people being very religious, a Bible in every house, and quite often the family matriarch resorting to the Bible to figure things out and the choices they make. And on the other hand, you have a lot of the early circuit riders, the traveling preachers coming through the area, saying, what a bunch of heathens. What a bunch of absolute pagan heathens. These people are barely human, let alone God-fearing, church-going people. How do you rectify these two very different views?
Well, when the earliest people came here, of course, there was nothing, and that also meant no churches. And that's not to say they came without faith. I think a lot of them definitely had faith. A lot of them were believers. But it took a while to establish churches. Three Forks was established in 1790. That was their first church here. Cove Creek in 1799. So eventually churches more or less spun off one another into different communities. And as people were able to raise the funds or to bring a pastor in, then of course those were created.
Actually, the church we're sitting in is the oldest in this county. It was formed in 1790. So back then, in this area, according to the minutes that we still have from 1790, they met once a month, and they met on Saturday. So that left 3 weeks in the month that you were worshiping at home with your family.
As communities in Watauga grew, so did the number of churches. As churches became more numerous, they began to exert a bigger moral and social influence in the area. It's in the 1790s that you start to see them reprimanding and disciplining their members through the practice of excommunication, which would later be known as churching.
The first time that I actually read about being churched, they did not use the term churched in the minutes. They used excommunicated. that happened for various reasons, one being Daniel Boone's nephew and his wife were excommunicated the first time for her not getting along with several of the ladies in the church. They were later reinstated after the elders of the church went and spoke with them, and they had to come and make a public formal apology in front of the church to be let back in the congregation.
The church was also very disciplined in the early days, even more so than today. We might look back on it now and laugh and think they were a little strict, and they probably were with some things. I know a few people were churched, and what was meant by that term was that you were brought before the church to answer some charge that was placed against you. So, some of those early charges were dancing at a frolic, or running with the Methodists. If you were Baptist and you were caught running with the Methodists, that was an offense. So things like that. I know I had an uncle several generations back named Counsel Harmon, and he told the jack tales, and he liked to dance, and he liked to nip at the bottle a bit, and so he had to come several times and what they called admit and fess before the church, admit and confess to his wrongdoings.
Mitt and Fess? Really? Running around with Methodists? Heavens to Betsy! It kind of makes you wonder about some of the other things the early folk used to do for fun. You ever heard of a shivaree?
I think a lot of the fun stuff in the mountains came later, after 1800. Before 1800, population was not very dense. If you had fun, you were probably going to do it yourself because everybody was too far away. The tradition of the shivaree developed where everybody could get together and cut loose. A shivaree, there are a lot of different variations on what it was, but in its essence was, we're all going to get together here and we're going to eat, dance, and drink for a while. Maybe for the evening, maybe for a day, maybe for a few days. Depending on the time of year, and that could be very seasonal. You did not have a shivaree when everybody was trying to get the corn crop in. Everybody was busy. You didn't have a shivaree right when they were trying to plant. Everybody was busy. But there was downtime in between. Midsummer, everything's under control. You can take a day off or 2 days off.
Some of the enjoyments that people in the backcountry here developed for fun musical instruments. The fiddle instead of being called the violin, clogging, dancing, the excommunication early on being for excessive drink and dancing.
Three of the things that they really loved to do in the 1700s was, of course, have shooting matches with each other, and they would throw tommyhawks and wrestle.
All things considered, the people that first settled what is known today as Watauga County were a hardy people who were fiercely independent. For generations, they raised their families and crops in relative isolation from the outside world. Always wary of authority and of those from off the mountain, they handled their own problems and took care of their own. These are traits that can still be seen today.
I grew up in unusual circumstances here, I guess. Both of my parents grew up without electricity. We still ran cattle and grew tobacco growing up because they wanted to do that. I moved to Alaska right after college, and I moved into the bush when I was 21 years old. The closest town was 30 miles away, and you could get there by boat or float plane, and that was it. I was very happy. I was a little nervous when I did it, but I wasn't nervous enough to not do it. But I think it goes back to that streak of independence.
I feel like that the people here felt like that they knew what was best for themselves. And I feel that same way now. And it's just, I think it's in your genes, that if you go back to the DNA of the people that came over, you'll find that the actual people that started this country, the DNA is leave us alone. We just want to do what we do and keep going.